Comics are static. I've started my first episode off saying this, and I've no doubt said it in the 50 plus episodes that have followed even more times. Which is why it's impressive when you can find an artist who can make this static medium feel imbued with motion, and even more impressive when that motion feels quick, almost like it's whizzing by on the page. David Aja is one of those artists, and his work on Hawkeye is an endless resource of clever visual tricks. I've spoken before about his heavily panelled pages and how they work to create a more visually interesting way to deal with essentially a page of talking. The episode is linked in the description and at the end of this episode, but this time I wanted to talk specifically about creating a sense of movement through panels and across panels. I'll be using a small handful of examples from issue 6 of the Hawkeye series with Matt Fraction and Matt Hollingsworth to help explain. You're watching Strip Panel Naked, I'm Haas, and I'm going to show you some of the cool stuff lurking in the pages of some of the best comics. So there's two separate methods I want to talk about that Aja employs here in Hawkeye. The second method will be coming in its own episode very soon, so in this we'll focus on the first method, which is a single image essentially being split into multiple panels. There's two moments it occurs in issue 6. The first is when characters on the roof hear the bad guys, two gangsters in the red tracksuits, calling for them from street level. The second case comes a little nearer the end of the issue, where Barton is kicked out of the back of this van. Probably the first thing you'll notice immediately is that they both take place in silhouette. I don't think that's by accident. I've seen this in other work, including a good example by Luca Casalanguida from James Bond, where the silhouette is used as a good way to ask readers to focus on the image as an overall image, rather than specific details about the characters or anything else. It gives you a sense of image, distance, scale, drama, rather than needing any specifics about people. Similarly, Skyfall has its fight sequence told through silhouette, and the point is the same. By dropping out character detail and focusing just on shapes, we're being asked to focus on the movement of those shapes more so than anything else. And on that first example, the action is broken into essentially two panels. We've got the characters running and the characters looking over the edge. The point down from the character gives us our eye line, and the straight line vertical of the building's edge invites us to follow it all the way down. Aja can get away with panels like this pulling you down, specifically because he doesn't really use very tall panels that often in Hawkeye. A lot of what you'll see are panels that take up either a tier or two at most. Sometimes they're only taking up a tier and actually he just splits tiers. Here the panel is almost 3 tiers tall, and it sits to add a particular sense of scale and distance. So when we look left and we see one of the baddies shouting, "Hey bro," and looking up, the distance is actually being reinforced by the panel we can see to the right side of it. In that way, it ends up imbuing these other two panels on the left side with a sense of scale themselves, and almost works like a split screen to remind us, as we read these two panels, that they're being placed below the panels we've just seen. It's interesting as a point about the medium because typically we see panels working via juxtaposition, right? The difference between panel 1 and panel 2 tells us a little bit of information. Here's a woman speaking, panel 2 lets us know it's to Clint, who speaks back. Panel 1 shows two characters running, panel 2 tells us where they ended up. Placing them apart is two separate images, placing them together gives us story and meaning, right? What's interesting about the tall panel is its relationship with the two stacked panels to the left of it, because it works in a similar, but also I guess kind of a different way, because it does inform those two panels. It tells us where these characters are in relation to the other characters we've just been seeing. But it also serves to continually contextualize both of those panels by having it run alongside them. You're keenly aware of the height because of the left to right eye line you're going to be used to. You'll keep hitting that wall of the building on the right side of the images. If you flip the image and place that to the left side, the effect will be a bit different, because it feels like you just start reading against those two tiers, but here you're reading across left to right and bumping up against the building both times. It keeps reminding you it exists, basically, and that's pretty much all because of its height. The other example works a little differently, but it shares a lot in common. As I mentioned, the silhouette works in the same way. We're focusing not on details, but on overall movement and motion, on the idea of what's happening in the panels rather than specifics or detail. There's a lot of small elements at work in this one sequence though, and it's one of my favourite sequences in the whole of this run, because it's a really, if I could overstress really here, clever use of the medium. The first panel shows the front of the van. The snow kicking up around the tyre implies movement, or probably more likely coming to a stop. We also know that because it's the only thing in the panel that hasn't got a snow layer on top of it. It's not like this van has been parked up for ages or anything. That's just a cool, smart choice by Aja. It probably goes unnoticed, but it's a nice way of implying some kind of movement in a silhouetted front-facing image. And actually later on in the book when we see a similar panel, we see the van with a layer of snow on it. And then he pulls our eye up to the back of the van on a tier above that panel layer and this small panel. Aja uses white negative space incredibly well in this book, and this is a brilliant example of how and why. We see the door of the van open. Another creator could have just stacked these two panels and have the same width, and hey, that actually could work as a way to do this. It misses one key element though, what this whole episode was about: movement. Because by limiting the width of the top panel to the right side, and then letting it extend when Hawkeye gets thrown out of the van, it creates movement to the right side. We stop looking at the negative space because there's no more imagery for us to see there. So when we look down, now we've got to be pulled across to the right, and it creates a really heavy sense of that left to right movement. But it's not that Hawkeye has just appeared in the space, which is what it could have looked like if AHA had made those two stacked panels the same width. But it's that the actual panel itself has expanded to the right to make sure it has enough room to catch Hawkeye in the panel framing itself. It almost feels like a whip pan from left to right. You know, for the most part, panels, no matter what shape or style they come in, be it circular clocks or regular oblongs, they're our windows into the story we're being told. Particularly with something like Hawkeye, which is so heavily panelled. So we see our panel borders as the limit to what is important information, or what is necessary for the story we're being told by the creators. So when we see the van door open, we're being told that this is all that's happening here in this panel, in this moment. There's nothing else to show us. And when the panel border expands for the panel below, now we're being told, so hold on, now he's being thrown this way, so I need to expand to show you that. That heavily implies a strong sense of movement, and it's a glorious thing by having them on separate tiers, because it also gives us that eye movement of down and across, or even diagonally across if you go straight to Hawkeye's silhouette. Either way, you're getting the sense of him moving across and down via the eye lines. The final panel of the sequence shows where Hawkeye's ended up, even further away from the van, alone, on all fours, bruised and beaten. You can chart that diagonal line backwards from this final position to the top panel of the van, so you're forced up, to right and down, and it's making you actually feel like this is something unfolding and expanding as you look. Your eye and brain create movement. Those two examples there use a lot of similar techniques. They're both being built from changing tiers and heavy silhouettes that ask us to focus on shape and movement, while building their own sense of height and distance across the tiers. The thing about this technique is it requires panels. It's a very specific way of doing this, because the van sequence, for example, doesn't work quite as strongly if you try to do that in only two panels, no matter what combination of panels you chose. Similarly, with the looking over the edge of the building sequence, that works so well because of how the rest of the book is formed with its large amount of tiers, often between 6 and 8 per page, and how very, very few panels will ever be as tall as 3 tiers. To work in this way, you're changing the way you approach your storytelling generally, which is probably why we only see something like this in AHA's work when talking about mainstream superhero comics anyway. But it goes to show the real true versatility of how comics can be manipulated to create sequences that are both fun, bouncy moments, and ones that work to manipulate a reader cleverly through the use of medium. AHA's work on Hawkeye will be a constant source of inspiration for those interested in how commercial, mainstream superhero work can be an opportunity to really push the boundaries of visual storytelling. Thanks for watching. I'll be adding a second part to this episode showing more techniques of AHA's work to create the bouncing movement very, very soon. And Strip Panel Naked continues to be supported by the amazing Patreons via patreon.com/strippanelnaked. For their pledges, they get access to a vault of exclusive content updated every single week. I'd love your support too. For more comics talk and analysis, you can find me on Twitter at HassanOE. And finally, hit subscribe and the notification button to stay up to date with all the latest episodes, and I'll see you next time.